Hello, everyone. Welcome to Feedstuffs 365. I'm Sarah Muirhead. Joining us today is Dr. Al Kertz, and our topic is that of the addition of milk replacers to pasteurized whole milk for dairy calves. Before we get into today's discussion, I want to remind you folks to post any questions you might have there in the chat media to post those questions directly in those channels. So, Dr. Kurtz, great to have you back with us.
It's good to be back once again, once a month.
Once a month, we're right
Right.
here. We're wrapping
Yeah.
up this year, right? And looking
Right.
forward to having some more discussions in 2025. So give us the insight here when it comes to milk replacers and pasteurized whole milk.
Well, on the surface, that seems like a pretty simple process, but we're dealing with a particular issue with young calves, not unlike human babies. They like consistency. So if you change the solids level or the amount you feed or when you feed it, calves often get somewhat upset. You may not know it because they don't cry like babies, but they don't do as well. So when you're feeding liquid, you have various sources of inconsistency. If you're feeding a pasteurized waste milk, you got the variable composition of the waste milk and the volume of the waste milk. And those sometimes people add milk replacer to supplement that. So the reason this can be an issue is because the osmolality can change. Whole milk is very favorable in its osmolality naturally, but if you add milk replacer to it, you can increase the osmolality. And if you increase it too much, and generally I'm thinking in terms of 16 to 18% solids in the milk replacer, you can create digestive upsets and also have sudden deaths because the amount, the density of it is too great. And if the calf doesn't drink enough water right away to kind of dilute down the osmolality, then you can have a digestive upset and sometimes a death. So that's the background of this. In this particular study, which was done in Iran, um, I want to first commend the authors for describing in the title the composition of the calf starter. This is becoming a big issue with me, and you'll hear more about it. And I've written a letter to the Journal of Dairy Science about this. We're not getting enough description of the starter, not just simply in the title, but in the description of what they fed is often not included. So that's another whole subject. But in this study, there were 45 Holstein calves removed from their dams and weighed, placed in clean individual pens, which had wheat straw. And then they were fed 6 liters good quality maternal colostrum um, in 2 separate feedings within 6 hours of birth. And they assayed the colostrum with a Brix meter so that they only used the high quality colostrum. And that showed up because their average total serum proteins were 6.4, and the old standard is 5 or 5.5, so that's well above that. So they managed to have a good set of calves, and there were 24 female calves and 21 male calves. Since they had 3 treatments, that was almost equal numbers, 8 females and 7 males. The calves were then moved from the pens to the separate individual pens, and then they were fed 4 liters of milk, of transition milk on day 2, and then 1 of 3 dietary treatments. So if we look at those 3 treatments, the first one was conventional, and that was about 1.25 pound daily of solids from the whole milk. So that's the control, and that was fed from 3 to 56 days. And then that was cut in half for 57 to 59 days, which is a short period before they were fully weaned. And they averaged 70.2 pounds of dry milk solids, that particular controlled treatment. And then there was another second treatment, which had a short duration of adding milk replacers to the milk. So they had the 1.27 pounds base from the milk, and then they added, let's see here, from days 3 to 9, 2 pounds, up to 2 pounds a day, and then days 10 to 41, they went all the way up to 2 pounds, and then they cut that back to 1.27 pounds from 42 to 56 days. So it was only for that short period of time up front. They averaged about 93 pounds of solids versus 70 for the controls. And then the third treatment was they had a longer duration of adding milk replacers to the milk. So they had about 1.25 pounds daily from the milk from days 3 to 9, and 2 pounds daily from the milk plus milk replacer from days 50 to 56, and then 1 pound after that. So that's kind of the basis of the three different treatments. They also fed this, and there was 105 pounds of the third treatment. So you can see that the dry solids from the milk and milk replacer are much higher in the third treatment than the other two treatments. Then they fed them twice a day, and this is often why people add milk replacer to pasteurized waste milk, because they don't want to feed more than twice a day, so they don't feel like they can feed more volume, so they increase the solids level. Now, they also were fed a starter. So let's take a look at that for a minute. Well, the milk replacer, by the way, was about it was 22 protein and 17% fat. They were weaned in day 60, and again, I commend the authors for continuing the measurements and observations to day 76. This is another issue with a lot of calf studies in which they wean them and they cut the study off there. When you do that, you don't have any idea whether there's any post-weaning carryover effect, whether positive or negative or not at all. So that's another area that we have a deficiency in many calf studies done. Okay, the calves received a blend of a starter plus 8% chopped second cut alfalfa hay, like as a TMR throughout the study. Now, here's a couple issues there. When you chop alfalfa hay, the leaves are very fragile, and they often crumble and become dusty, and you may lose some of their content. There was a recent study published in Journal of Dairy Science where they assayed the chopped alfalfa hay and only had about 12% protein, which meant it lost a lot of the leaves. So that can be a problem there. The starter had, they were trying to feed the starter to have 1.65 pounds of daily gain along with the milk and milk replacer. Now, the starter, they ground the grain, the corn and barley, which was in the starter. Now, that's counterproductive because you lose the particle size effect and the rumination value of that. But then when you do that, you better add some forage, because otherwise you're going to have rumen acidosis in the calves and they won't eat as well. Not that they like this starter as well, because if you got ground starter plus chopped hay in it, it's not as palatable, as easy to eat as it would be if it was a texturized study. So that's some of the limitations and conditions under which they were feeding. Now, they did feed water, and they had a spigot in the pen, so they were feeding water. But unfortunately, they didn't measure the water intake. And I guess the only way you could do that is if you had a meter in the line, and that would be an expensive proposition. So let's look at the data then in Table 1. You can see the actual amount of solids intake, about 67 on the control, where it was only milk. And then when they fed also some milk replacer in the milk for a short period, you got up to 88 pounds. But then when they fed it for the full, almost a full length before they began the weaning process for a longer period, you had 102 pounds. So there's a nice little spread there on the milk solids intake. Now look at the starter intake. The first two, the conventional and the short fed, there was really not much difference, but that's because the short fed was for a very short period of time, and that was early in their life, and so starter intake is very low there. So it didn't have much of an impact on starters, you can see. But when they fed more milk solids and milk replacer for a longer period of time, notice that the starter intake went down. That's this inverse relationship, which we see in a number of studies, where the more milk or milk solids or milk replacer that you feed, the less starter they will eat. So their total dry matter intake then was 2.5, 3 pounds, and 3. So even though they were fed more milk replacer for a longer period of time with the third treatment, because they ate less starter, their total dry matter intake was not really different from the short fed group. So you see the difference then in some increased energy intake, metabolizable energy, as well as crude protein. The body weight was virtually the same, 87, 88 pounds. If we look at the weaning body weight and you look at the daily gain at weaning, you see that they were looking for 1.65 pounds. They never reached it. The control daily gain at weaning was 1.35. The next group, the short fed, a little bit uptick, about 10% to 1.5. But then the longer fed milk replacer, because they ate less starter, they didn't really see much of a benefit, 1.46 versus the control of 1.35. And the final body weight then, if you look at the daily gain after weaning, remember they went out to 70 days. So the daily gain after weaning was on the control 2.14, almost identical. The other one 2.18. And then it jumped up on the long fed milk replacer group 2.58. I'm not quite sure why that occurred, unless it's because they ate less starter before they weaned, and then they increased their starter intake more after weaning. And remember, with the chopped forage, you also have the likelihood that you're going to have some gut fill. So that daily gain might have also been partly or wholly a gut fill. Then the daily gain overall, 1.6 pounds, 1.7, 1.79. So that doesn't look so bad, but remember, this is 70 days. If you look at the Dairy Calf and Heifer Association's gold standards for daily gain prior to weaning, it should result in their doubling of their birth weight at the end of 2 months. So typically that means you need to be about 1.5 pounds or so before weaning. And in this study, the middle treatment and the long fed, they were close to that 1.5. They were 88 pounds average at weaning. So they would have had to be twice that. That's 176 pounds. So you see those two treatments, the weaning body weight, were right at that. And then the feed efficiency also reflects those numbers. Now, there's there were other measurements and blood values taken in this study, but they didn't show any differences other than what we've talked about here. Now, the authors did acknowledge that osmolality can be a factor. And I think it's a factor whenever you get over about 15% solids, depending on the other factors. And one of those is water intake. So I wish they had measured water intake, because then that would have showed us whether, when they put more milk replacer in with the milk, did those calves compensate by the increased osmolality by drinking more water at that time. That can happen, but you can't count on it happening because calves don't know that. They should be drinking more water, so it may or may not happen. And then they also measured fecal scores, which I didn't show, but and they did it prior to the morning feeding, which I thought was a little bit strange, rather than after feeding sometime during the day. There were really no differences there in the fecal scores. Sometimes you can see the differences if you got a more uh, solids going in to the diet with less water, um, and then we can also, as a reference, look at the last two National Animal Health Monitoring Surveys. The the last one was 2014, which is 10 years ago, and I don't know that there's going to be done again. Before that was 2007. From 2007, the average amount of milk replacer or milk fed was 4 quarts. So that's not that much. And then the average age of weaning was 8 weeks. If you look at 2014 data, it went from 4 quarts to 6 quarts. Now, some might say, well, that's not a whole lot. Well, it is. It's a 50% increase. And probably because of that, the age of weaning went from 8 weeks to 9 weeks. So those are some of the factors that you have to consider when you're putting together a study. The nature of the starter, how much of a role it plays, what its composition is, and then, of course, how much liquid you're feeding. So this study showed some of the effects. So if I would make a recommendation, my main thing would be, well, don't grind the grain. And if you feed the grain either rolled or partially processed, barley, I would not do anything more than roll because it's highly fermentable starch. So you don't steam flake it, you don't crack it. You can just simply roll it. And the same thing with corn if you want to. If it isn't really hard like a flinty corn, then you can feed it whole by itself, or maybe rolling. And then when you do that and you have over 50% of the whole grain, you don't need to add any hay, chopped or chopped straw. And when you don't have to buy straw and a chopper and have a place and a facility and labor involved, that increases your cost. But very few operations think of it that way. They think of a texturized starter being more expensive, which it is. But I've calculated at the worst case over 3 months, and I would feed it through the first 3 months, maybe $25 per calf. Now, right now, calves in the U.S. can be running that at $2,500 or $3,000 as first calf heifers or bred heifers. So $25 is just a drop in the bucket of that cost rather than having a chopper and do all those things. So that's kind of a side issue, but it does enter into these studies. And this is why I think studies need to have a good description in their protocol of the starter, and it needs to be reflected in the title as well.
Why do you think that hasn't been done?
I think it's because people don't realize it's important. Um,
Okay.
I'm in the process of writing an article and also this letter to the editor of Journal of Dairy Science. Um, they don't realize it, and the reviewers don't either know it or don't pick up on it. But when we do dairy cow studies, we describe their diet, we do particle sizes and all of that sort of thing. And with the calf, if anything, it's even more important, and we're not doing it at all. So it's a big deficiency in our research. And in addition, then what I find happening is that a lot of times when people do reviews or do their references to other studies, they'll say, well, this study found this or that. And they won't consider whether those studies fed 5 different kinds of starters. And so they confounds the results in the interpretation. So really, whenever they reference another study, they should look at it and say, well, In this study, it fed this kind of starter, and this one, this kind of study, because it's a big variable. But we're not doing it yet.
Interesting. Yeah, I never even thought of that. That's a great point. You make some great points there. A reminder to our audience, if you guys have any questions, post those there in the chat. You also can find Al's column right there posted in the chat. And you can find it also in the December digital issue of Feedstuffs, which will be coming to your inbox next week. So what final message do you want to leave our audience with here today, Al? What kind of key points, key takeaways you want them to remember?
We started out talking about consistency. So consistency in the liquid feeding program is very important. You don't want the solids to vary. Whole milk has about 12.5, 13% solids, maybe a little more. And so you want to keep that as consistent as possible. And if you got pasteurized waste milk, you can use a Brix meter to look at the solids to see if it stays the same. And if you need to add milk replacer, remember, in most cases, you better also be adding water to make whatever added milk replacer you have about 13% solids, or else you might create this problem with a high osmolality and digestive upsets and even possibly sudden death. So consistency is the word.
Yes, very important. So thank you, Dr. Kertz. Thank you so much for your time here today.
You're welcome. See you next month.
Yeah, happy holidays.
All right,
We want to thank all of you for joining us as well. A reminder that all Feedstuffs 365 sessions are available in on-demand format at feedstuffs.com. Until next time, for Feedstuffs 365, I'm Sarah Muirhead.